Let me turn it on right now. There we go. Again, I will probably stay with the green background because I wasn't able to switch it to something more fancy. But it's all virtual anyways, right? So let me first switch to my first slide. Essentially, it's the title of my presentation for today, Silicon Valley Framework for Digital Transformation. And before I start my presentation, I would like to welcome everyone for our program, as Vlas has already done, but I also wanted to add to his greetings my personal encouragement to everyone who is participating today and the following days in our program to actively participate, take part, not just be a passive listener, but also be an active participant in our program. Ask questions. I understand that it's more difficult, of course, when we sit all at home and we're all busy with something else, trying to run multiple things, but it always helps to get yourself immersed into the ideas, into the notions, including the impressions that you can get out of this direct communication. I guess what's happening right now is going to change the way how we communicate forever. And we better learn how to do it better, right? And not just be passive participants, even though we're all doing it from home now. But hopefully it will be over sooner than later. My presentation is called Silicon Valley Framework for Digital Transformation. But it's not really the framework, I would say. It's just a collection of thoughts and ideas and observations that we have picked up by working with the local technology companies. And I wanted to give some of them to you, to share those ideas with you, with the hope that you will be able to pick up some of those ideas for yourself, to kind of think about the way how you might better think about transforming your company and being more successful with digital, with the ways how you can digitally transform your business. So my background has been mostly academic in the past, but for the last 10 years, since I founded this company.
Your presentation is frozen.
Oh. Okay, let's.
Maybe you want to reshare. You probably shared just the window. So
okay. Let me. Thank you for telling me about this.
You probably just need to share the different window.
One second.
Yes, perfect.
Yes. Okay. So when I switched from here to here, you can see this switch. Okay. Okay. Good. Thank you for helping me. Excuse me. So my background has been largely academic until the last 10 years, since I switched from a research career that I've been doing at Stanford, where I was a student before that and a researcher. And then I became, I would mostly describe myself as an entrepreneur for the last 10 years, trying to build a business and trying to educate our clients with all the lessons, like I said, that we have observed by working with different companies. So with that, let me switch to the agenda that I've prepared for today. And again, feel free to send us any of your questions in the chat, right? Or raise your virtual hand if you want to ask a question in the middle. Like, it's all fine. We will try to address all of those questions and answer any of your any issues that will arise during the presentation, or even after that. If you have anything that you would like to discuss, please feel free to contact Vlas and myself. We'll be happy to talk to you directly, one-on-one, about any issues that they have. So today's agenda is why is digital transformation more important today than ever before, right? And a kind of a short answer to that is that disruption has become a new normal, right? And what we're observing here today, all of us living in a smaller world than ever, is only underlying that fact. The second question, what unique opportunities does this particular downturn present for digital transformation? And a third one that I kind of try to fashion around 3 horizons of digital transformation, that's the experience of how companies have been transforming themselves, already being digital, keeping transforming themselves, not stopping at what they've achieved so far along 3 different horizons. And that's what we will discuss, right? And the last question is how Silicon Valley might be helpful in this process. Now, let me jump to the first question right away. Why are we talking about disruption being a new normal? Well, none of us get surprised after 4 months of sitting at home that there are whole regions, Europe, Asia, pretty much the entire world, North America, of course, South America, all are sitting at home, right, trying to work. And even when you look at some maps that I'm showing you here, which is particular here is Italy, where the pollution levels have gone down significantly as a result of the reduced economic activity, right? I guess there are some benefits of the fact that the world is not working as hard as it used to, but essentially what we're talking about is that there are billions of people who are now sitting at home, and many of those people do not really work at the full capacity as they did before this crisis, right? We now have gotten into a global recession situation, right? The most immediate impact of COVID is that it's not really a high likelihood anymore that I'm saying here. According to the most recent economic data that I have seen, the world is already in the recession, and it's probably going to stay in that recession now for the rest of this year, right? And we all have to be prepared for the fact that even when we when we will get this public health crisis under control, and when there will be vaccine available, the world is not going to just miraculously recover, right? The economic impact of this crisis is much bigger than even, I would dare to say, a public health impact, of course, right? I mean, there are a lot more people who will be suffering from the economic consequences of this crisis, economic aspects, I would say, of this crisis, rather than directly from being directly affected by it. But of course, it depends on how widespread it will become, the COVID itself will become before we get the vaccine trying to stop it, or any kind of other medicine, right? But disruption by itself is not something new to the US economy, and I would even say global economy, right? We often now think that companies, businesses are disrupted because of the exogenous shock, but that's actually not true. When you look at the lifespan, average lifespan of the most successful, largest companies in the United States economy in the past, that lifespan has been reduced from 70 years in average to only 20 years now. And it's projected to get even lower in the coming years, right? More than half of the existing companies have disappeared from the so-called S&P 500 index in the last 20 years. And S&P 500, as you might know, Standard & Poor's 500, these are top 500 companies. This is the index that is tracking what are the most successful companies, right? And in the US economy. So half of those companies have disappeared in the last 20 years. They dropped out from that index. They have become smaller. Many of them have gone bankrupt, and so on. So that kind of disruption has been going on for quite a while, right? And we hear about it pretty much on a daily basis, have been hearing. Again, what I'm describing right now, there's nothing really that would surprise you, right? We all hear about disruptive innovation for probably the last, I would say 15, 20 years, at least here in Silicon Valley for sure. Not just the companies have disappeared, lots of professions have also been disrupted and displaced, right? I've collected here a small group of black and white photos that are showing some professions that used to be popular, I would put it this way, in the past, and yet none of them exist anymore, right? Some of them are pretty fancy, it's pretty colorful, I would say, despite black and white photos here, in terms of what people used to be preoccupied with, right? But the new technologies have displaced all of these professions. And it's not just about low-end jobs, as people sometimes imagine. It's also about a lot of high-end jobs, like lawyers, like accountants, like financial advisors. I've picked up this slide, for example, from our partner's presentation from Oracle Corporation, where they talk about the displacement of nearly 98% of financial risk managers, for example, because of the automation, right, of their jobs. I heard you talking about robotics process automation as a big trend right now here in Silicon Valley, which is specifically focused on automating the whole job functions within the companies, right? So there are all kinds of directions in which professions now vanish, being displaced and being disrupted by new technologies, right? There's nothing surprising about that, of course, right? The way how people react to that, that is more interesting to observe. This infographics that I'm showing here, we published, created it about a couple of years ago to demonstrate how the average length of the employment in Silicon Valley among the typical workers in Silicon Valley companies. So that average length of employment has been less than 2 years. People adapt to this high degree of uncertainty when you have one company replacing another one very quickly by jumping from those companies very quickly, and essentially preserving their job skills by staying with the companies that continue developing that a new kind of expertise within themselves, and also, of course, staying relevant to the market, right? I mean, obviously, it's a very stressful situation when you're forced to switch jobs every 2 years. It's really nothing that, I would recommend anyone in this world, right? It's a very high stress situation. But at the same time, by doing this, there are lots of examples here in Silicon Valley how people have climbed the executive ladders to become, to grow their careers essentially by jumping between jobs very quickly, I would say between the companies, also changing their jobs. But disruption is not just about individual companies or individual professions. It has also engulfed the whole industries, right? And here's just one example. US printed media industry has pretty much vanished before our eyes in the last approximately 10 years, 15 years, right? The decline in the printed media revenues have started in early 2000 since there was a recession in this country, the so-called dot-com boom recession. But then as a result of that recession, the new tech companies have started actively disrupting this business, this industry. Companies like Google and Facebook have pretty much stolen the revenues of the entire industry by digitizing advertising industry, right? Now that everyone is sitting on the internet, not watching TV or reading newspapers, obviously the advertising budgets have gone the same way. Another industry that has been pretty much decimated and is still being killed right now is, of course, retail, right? We have assembled here all of the brands, retail chain brands that have disappeared over the last 5 years in the US. And as you can see, it's been an avalanche of those companies that have filed for Chapter 11, for bankruptcy over the last years. We still don't have data on 2020, but we can only imagine how many more companies will be disrupted, not just because we got companies like Amazon completely transforming our shopping experience, moving it online, but also COVID as well, preventing those physical shoppers who used to still continue do shopping physically, now for pretty much big chunk of this year being prevented to go to the stores or reduced their capacity. So there will be even more bankruptcies. And I guess what I'm trying to say here is that COVID works hand in hand, glove in glove, so to say, with digital disruption, empowering that digital disruption and making it even a bigger force to reckon with. Now, these are the results of the survey that Harvard Business Review has taken among its top subscribers, asking only one question: how vulnerable do you feel your company is to digital transformation, to disruptive innovation? To disruptive innovation rather than digital transformation, of course, because usually digital transformation, it's the desirable process from within. Disruptive innovation, it's the unwelcome process from outside, right? When your company gets redefined and disrupted in many ways. And these are the numbers that you see, right? Not surprisingly, media has come up on the top because most of it has been decimated, like I said, but also the other industries. They all feel one way or the other vulnerable to this process. And of course, if this survey was taken this year, in 2020, we would probably see much higher numbers, right? Because the disruption now is being fueled by different causes, right? But again, the tech companies, those who have successfully transformed themselves or built themselves based on digital data and digital business models, they are coming up on the top, right? And that's what is happening right now. COVID is accelerating this process. These are the top 5 positions by market cap that used to be the companies from all kinds of industries about 20 years ago. Moving fast forward 15 years to 2016, all those 5 positions have not only increased in their market cap significantly by almost like 50%, but also replacing the leaders from different industries only by tech companies, right? Technology is now the necessary requirement for you to be qualified as a leader. Now, when you look at what has happened since then, over the last 4 years, you can see that that valuation of the top 5 leaders has jumped almost threefold, 3 times, right? From Apple, from about $600 billion to 1.4. I think it's even bigger right now, 1.5, I think, or close to that right now. So this is a significant advancement of the digital leaders. What characterizes all of these 5 companies is not just the fact that they're leaders, that they're digital companies. It's also the fact that all of them are platforms. And we will talk a little bit about that. What does it mean to be a platform nowadays? My personal conviction is that Every company that wants to be successful in the future is not just have to become a technology company, not just needs to have its own software development division that would help digitize the processes within the company. It has to be a platform as well. We're all becoming platforms without realizing that. And let's talk about that trend in a few minutes. But before that, I just wanted to say that it's not just about 5 leaders who have the highest market cap. What I'm showing here is another big wave. Hundreds of companies, digitally born, digitally native, that have been built and are now growing very fast. Most of them growing exponentially, I would claim, and their number is also growing exponentially. The so-called unicorns. These are the private startups that were valued by investors at some point above $1 billion valuation, which is if you would ask me 15 years ago, would be a nonsensical proposition. When I was a student at Stanford and we were applying for business plan competitions to build all kinds of startups, nobody ever heard about a startup that would be valued above $1 billion. It was just crazy to hear numbers like that. But look how many of them have come out on the market now. Obviously, there is a bit of a overvaluation of assets happening here, right? The last 20 years have seen a lot of asset inflation, right? This is why we have NASDAQ today, well, the last week, hitting the record number, even though there is more than 10% of unemployment in the United States right now, and yet NASDAQ and Dow Jones being so high. Why are they so high? Well, it's because the US government is pouring billions, now trillions of dollars to prop up the economy. Of course, that cash is now showing up on those markets by increasing the nominal value of those assets. A similar process has been happening for the last 15 years here in Silicon Valley, when startups have been growing, their valuation has been growing in nominal terms, simply because these companies are probably the most attractive opportunities for investment. They're also extremely risky opportunities, and yet people are willing to take the risks when they're financing those companies. What's interesting about these companies, I could talk for a few hours actually about this phenomenon of unicorns, but I would rather talk to you about the way how many of them have achieved their success. Some of those lessons actually are very useful to think about in the context of established companies, in the way how you would think about transforming your business by learning some of the secrets, I would say a playbook of those unicorns. Of course, you have to be careful about any of those lessons, because there is always a flip side of any process that requires digitization. And yet I still wanted to give you some of those lessons, right? The reason why they're growing so fast, these companies, is that they have been employing lots of different techniques, I would say, and methodologies to their growth. It's not just the fact that they are using digital in all kinds of other technologies and they have better or newer, I would say, products. It's also about their business model. It's also about their strategy on the market. It's about putting all of those things together. And that's what I want to discuss just very quickly with you. What are those, a few secrets? Well, I don't know if any of you have ever, I'm going to give you some books that I would recommend reading about this phenomenon, right? Which generally describes what's happening here in Silicon Valley. The book at this point that I would recommend would be called Exponential Organization by Salim Ismail, where it's a bit dated book, but it's still extremely useful to understand how you get exponential unicorns growing so fast, right? And what kind of secrets they're employing to their growth and development. So let me start from some of these ideas here that I have they have put as a brain of a company. That left side of that brain is responsible for creativity, for generating ideas. The right side of the brain is responsible for turning those ideas into products and scaling them. The first is that, of course, if you are a small startup who wants to transform your own niche, that is not going to attract attention of investors, right? You need to, if you build a new business, you better build that business around a really visionary, big goal. Transformative. It's Salim calls it massive transformative goal. You can call it a big vision, right? A big vision that can transform the whole industry, if not the world. And I'm using here on the right side some of the mission formulations that these companies have applied to themselves, specifically for the purpose of attracting resources to their business, right? If you have a big goal, it means the best talents will pay attention to who you are. If you have a big goal, that means the biggest investors will pay attention to who you are. It means that all things equal, if you are capable of executing on that goal, you will be more attractive than your competition. The bigger, the better. Staff on demand. That's another interesting secret that these companies have been employing, right? The reason why staff is on demand is emerging as a kind of it's a typical way of increasing your workforce. It's because it's much easier to pivot your business and change your core expertise when you don't have to keep your entire workforce on the payroll all the time, right? So staff on demand helps you be much more flexible in terms of the size of your workforce, but also in terms of the core expertise, right? And change it much faster. Now, we talked about robotics process automation just for a second, right? And it's now has become one of the key trends again, how you automate your business from within, right? And of course, behind pretty much all robotics, behind all of the automation processes are algorithms, right? So algorithmic decision-making helps you avoid biases. It also helps you automate your decision-making process at every level, and the lower, the more automated processes you're gonna get, right? So for those of you who are not familiar with this trend, robotic process automation, I would encourage you to look into some literature that discusses that, or just the best practices. There are a few companies that have become extremely successful, the darlings of venture capital, because they are now have started offering those services to businesses all over the world. You don't have to do robotic process automation all by yourself from within your company. There are some really good companies that can help you do that. Now, community, right? What is community? Well, essentially, these are people who are your followers, those who believe in your mission, but they don't work with your company. They just want to support you because what you do matters to them. That comes back to having a large big transformative purpose for your goal, for your company as a part of this, right? If you are trying to transform the world, there will be lots of people outside of your company who are willing to contribute to the success of your company without necessarily being compensated for that. Of course, the biggest example of this trend would be so-called open source companies, right? Open source gives away their product for free to everyone who wants to use it and develop it further, right? So usually open source based companies, and some of them are extremely successful companies. For example, Red Hat, it's an open source company, has been sold a couple of years ago for $7 billion. And there are scores and scores of companies like that that have actually decided to open up their product to anybody to come and contribute to building that product by giving it away and building their business model around supporting that community, which focuses on building their product. It's not really their product anymore because everyone is free to change that product, right? And fork the development of that product from one way to something else, right? So there are multiple versions of open source usually exist out there. People are developing it. And what's the point for them and the company to actually do that? Well, for the company, usually what happens is that the company decides to select a business model that supports that product. And it makes a lot of money just out of that supporting function. Usually, this kind of business model is being referred as commercial open source, COOS, or sometimes COSS, commercial open source software. And again, I would recommend you to look at that trend. It's not just about software products, actually. There are more and more hardware and all kinds of products that are being open sourced coming out of the market. And the reason why companies do that is because they want to build a large community who will build that product for free, which sounds pretty crazy, but that's what is happening right now. The next interesting trend is the use of third-party assets, right? Essentially, we're talking about a really high-speed growth of your company that owns nothing in terms of physical assets, in terms of any tangible assets, right? Companies like Uber or Airbnb or many, many other companies that I'm trying to show here on the right, examples of them, they position themselves deliberately as the assetless companies, so to say. Of course, they keep the most important assets, which is the intellectual property and commercial secrets of how they built their platforms, right? So usually this kind of business, when you run it without really having much of ownership of any assets, it's open to the companies that are willing to build platforms rather than be the owners of the assets. All right. And that's also been a huge trend right now. When I mentioned to you some, those unicorns previously, most of those unicorns are positioning themselves as companies like that, but not all of them, of course. There are quite a few, like Tesla, for example, that have been building physical products, and they're proud of being, developing their products and of course, developing the ownership of the entire manufacturing process around that. Now, another interesting trend, which I would call involvement, right? What does it mean, involvement? Well, it's a direct participation of your customers in the creation of your product. And even I would go even farther to say in the work of your company. This is the so-called feedback loops that the companies are now building, and actually building them inside of the products, if it's possible, so that the customers would actually feel that their voice is being heard, and not just being heard, but their voices are actually playing a direct part in reshaping the products, right? So when the customers and your clients actually feel empowered by your company to directly affect the future version of your product or the current state of your product, that transforms the entire dynamics between who the customers are and who the producers are, right? What we see happening right now is that customers are becoming increasingly co-producers of the products, right? And again, it's not like you have to pay them for that. They pay you for participating in the development of your product, right? Being your customers. And that is something amazing, again, to pay attention to and think about what are the ways how we can transform our companies to have a closer feedback loop with our customers by using new technologies. Interfaces essentially enable companies for large-scale communication with everyone else outside, with the so-called your ecosystem, right? It's all your partners, right? It's all your affiliates, your customers, the community, with pretty much everyone else who exists out there and who care about your company, right? One way to, in the past, those interfaces were limited to physical ways of communicating with the outside world. We used to have the PR departments. We used to have all kinds of government relationship departments. For large companies, it's still a necessity, right? But what's happening right now is that the digital companies are automating that process as well. The process of communicating with the outside world, with other companies, for example, in case of B2B businesses, are being automated through, that's what was referred by one of our participants as APIs, right? We're talking about essentially automated ways of communicating between products or platforms where those products are sitting on between each other. So you don't need anymore, again, physical people sitting and enabling that communication as it was done in the past. Now, the APIs allow companies to communicate with each other without having any humans standing on either side of that communication. Control panels. Why are control panels? Again, it's kind of a small thing, right? And we all are now accustomed to the idea of having some kind of a control panel helping us make the right decision. But I would say it's not really like the control panels, it's just the tip of the iceberg, right? In order to be able to manage your company by using control panels, you would need to digitize pretty much the entire information around within your company. So this way, you can make your leadership and your top managers can make decisions in an unbiased way and based on the data that gets collected at different levels of your company. And then control panels essentially bring all of that data together in order to help you navigate your company as if it was something like, I don't know, like an auto car, right? When we are incapable of controlling our car unless there were gauges in front of us, right? A dashboard, which would help us navigate that vehicle. And the same with the business, right? So this is why control panels are so important because dashboards essentially, right? It's because this is the way how the leadership can actually make sense of digitizing essentially your business for the decision-making purposes. Experimentation is another big part of the DNA of the new digital companies, right? And why is it so important to experiment? Well, in the world of fast changes, right? When the product development cycles have become really slim, right? They used to be very fat, very long, but now they're very narrow. You want to transform your business, you want to transform your product much more quickly based on small experiments. And usually the more risky experiment, the more bound for failure it is, right? So you want to run constantly the series of experiments within your company, and it has to become a part of your DNA of every company, not to be afraid to run those experiments, and yet somehow not to disrupt your business, of course, right? Because it's too easy. It's too easy to think about experimenting while you're also running your business, right? But again, when you do those experiments, the purpose of those experiments in the digital world is, of course, to find something that nobody understands, to find those small disruptive ideas that become big successes in the end of the day. I could give tons of examples here. Company like WhatsApp, for example, right? Those guys, like the two founders, were sitting and essentially playing with some software until they realized with those small experiments. Of course, they were a small company too. WhatsApp was just a piece of software, right? Nothing else. And yet the way they only have achieved success after they experimented with a bunch of ideas, right? And it's pretty much characteristic of any company that is now a prominent business here in Silicon Valley. You need to embed experimentation as a part of your DNA, right? Autonomy of your staff is another important element of that. If all people are working to implement and execute only one idea or only one product, only one business model within your company, of course, they're not going to be good for any experimentation, right? They're not going to be able to come up with their own thinking, their own ideas, and they're not going to be the source of creativity within your company. So a certain degree of autonomy has to be present within every company. And again, it has to be balanced, of course, against the strategic goals of every business, right? And the reason I mention autonomy here is because there were lots of examples of companies actually flattening their levels of management in order to make their company more mobile, more agile in terms of the ability to pivot and create new products. The other interesting trend is so-called social technologies, right? Essentially, these are collaboration tools that create social network effect within your company, but also between companies, right? And I'm just showing here just a handful of examples. There are obviously many more companies and products out there that make our collaboration within the company and between the companies much more efficient than we ever had before. We in our company are actively using, for example, Slack and Asana. Well, now we're all using Zoom and so on. I mean, all of these names are probably familiar to you. I would encourage you to look at the company at the bottom here in the right side, the GitHub company, right? GitHub, and there is another one, which is a more commercial version of it that has also a big step forward. It's called GitLab. These are two competing companies. There are a few more out there that essentially help large businesses to establish continuous innovation at the software level, right? These are the companies that are almost like I would say, project management companies as it applies to software development. But when you look at the way how they try to help companies that are going through digital transformation, you can see a certain discipline about the way how you could build your entire digital transformation around the existing processes in the software industry. So I would encourage you to look at that company specifically, even though maybe GitHub and GitLab, two different businesses. So this slide is kind of to summarize the ideas that I've just presented to you about the differences between the digital companies and incumbent traditional organizations, right? Now let me jump further quickly because I only have, how much time do I have left? Can you just navigate me a little bit so I would understand how
Yeah,
I have to move?
yeah, we have about 45 minutes left, but then please
45.
be aware of the questions.
Good, yes. So I'll try to limit myself to 30 minutes.
Yeah, but please do remember to speak a little bit slower for our simultaneous translation.
Oh, okay. Yes, I'll try to speak a little bit slower. Thank you. So the second kind of a big topic that I wanted to cover here in my presentation is what does this particular crisis, what kind of opportunities we can get out of this situation, right? How we can turn lemons into a lemonade, so to say. Well, first of all, like I said, now we are pretty much in the global recession. I mean, we all have to recognize that this situation is not going to end with the arrival of the cure for the COVID, right? We're going to have a bit of an inertia in the global terms that most of the companies are already showing in the red in terms of their performance. I heard yesterday, what was the company? I think it was Goldman Sachs, who said that the US economy will probably end up with the minus 6% of its GDP growth, right? I'm showing you data from IMF that is also showing kind of a similar minus 6% estimate of what's going to happen here in the United States and across many countries as well. We will see what happens in China, of course, right? Because China is also dependent in terms of its exports on the performance of other countries. But the good news here is that, and that was a big chunk of my past research, by the way. When I used to be a researcher, I used to study economic cycles, economic and political cycles, how they work. And the interesting thing is that during these cycles, actually, during the downturns, this is when most of the best and most successful companies have been built historically. It's not when the times are great, the successful companies survive and get established. It's when things are going south, going down, right? And the reason for that actually is very simple. It's a bit counterintuitive to think that the best businesses actually get built during the downturns, but actually it's true. There's a lot of logic to that. The simple explanation to that phenomenon is that resources and assets now are much more available, right? Including human capital, right? With the unemployment approaching, well, we will probably end up having here in the United States, unemployment being between 12 and 15% across different industries. It's much easier to hire people now than it was before the crisis, right? And people are willing to work much harder. Well, most people, I would say, right? Now, of course, we have a situation when people don't go to the offices. So there will be quite a bit of a change. But generally speaking, we know that assets and resources now much more available for building new ventures or implementing new ideas. Even within your companies, when you look around, you can actually see that, you know, when people were busy a year ago or even a half a year ago, it was much more difficult to get them involved in the new ideas, right? But now you have more free time on your hands and your leadership is probably more open to encourage you to think about the new ideas and the new ways how you can successfully transform your business. Ultimately, what we're talking about, I want to precede myself, is that we're talking about transforming it in a way that makes our businesses less vulnerable to physical disruption that we're experiencing right now. And there is a big opportunity in that process by itself, right? The US economy has been through the entire history of the United States, and I think it's more of a global trend. It's not just the US economy. We have been going through the booms and busts all the time. And this crisis specifically presents its own very interesting opportunities, I would say, for digital transformation. In the very simple terms, this downturn opens more space for digital companies than any physically encumbered businesses, physical asset encumbered businesses, right? The businesses that have physical assets and they are exposed now to disruption as a result of that, right? So in some interesting ways, COVID has become probably the biggest accelerator toward digital transformation. And some companies that were able to create those digital assets in advance, like the one that we're using right now for communicating with each other, Zoom has grown in the value a lot, right? So like I said, COVID is now becoming, is probably in some ways, sometimes more effective way of conveying the urgency of digital transformation than anyone else within the company. So we're talking about the situation when traditional revenues will continue declining even when COVID will be over, because the digital companies have now been encouraged more than ever to grow faster than ever, right? So every traditional company has to change its mindset from being a disrupted fortress, so to say, to become a disruptor itself. And the only way how you can become a disruptor yourself is when, of course, you start thinking about creating new products, including digital products that are built on the top of your physical products, and explore new industries and apply new business models for that purpose, right? This is what essentially disruptors do. And every company has a potential to be that kind of disruptor if you can build a new value on the market, new value that people will, your customers, your markets will appreciate, of course, right? What does it mean to be a self-disruptor? Well, let me just explain it to you in a few minutes. But as I said before, we have to learn this playbook of digital disruptors, right? I've given you a few lessons, what digital disruptors do. Now let me kind of give you a couple of more very interesting lessons, and one framework that is being actively used by technology companies when they think about allocating resources for innovation. The so-called 3 horizons of innovation. It's not a new approach. McKinsey has developed this approach about something like 15 years ago, but it has become very popular among the technology companies because it helps kind of understand how you should prioritize your resources when it comes to innovation, right? 3 horizons. Essentially, the whole idea starts from recognizing the fact that every horizon, essentially, it's the way how your particular product grows, right? That first, when you introduce a new product on the market, it grows, the sales of that product would grow really fast. And then over time, it would decline, right? Because of the competition, because of the saturation on the market, and so on. So in order to reinvigorate your company, you should not just focus on your existing business, on the evolution of your core business and incremental improvements. That remains to be, of course, the key attention, right? But then the second horizon is all about new opportunities with the business model innovation. Essentially, you think about producing new products, right? Without disrupting your existing business, right? You think about how you can create new products and services on the top of your existing business. And then on the top of that, a third horizon, which deals with the most uncertainty, where it's kind of difficult to predict the future. We're talking about new and sometimes very self-disruptive business models that you also have to explore in order to eliminate competition to yourself that is coming from those digital disruptors. You think about the way how you should successfully disrupt yourself. And I'll give you some examples of that. Google has applied this practice of 3 horizons to themselves by the so-called 70-20-10% rule. Eric Schmidt, who used to run that company for more than 10 years, has described that rule in his book. And I would encourage you to look at that book, where he said that they applied 70% of all of their creative resources to their search product, right? That was their kind of like a cash cow, right? And it still remains like that for Google. But Google has at the same time has been giving about 20% of resources, including the time of all of their employees. Like every employee could spend, every engineer could spend about 20% of their time on creating and building their own projects within the company, of course, being approved by the management. Gmail came out of that 20% second horizon, just to give you one example. And the third horizon, of course, for them were technologies that were completely unrelated or almost unrelated to search. Like, for example, Waymo, self-driving car technology. That was like a third horizon 10 years ago when they started doing that. But today we see these cars already driving on the streets of Bay Area, right? We still don't have a legislation which would allow Google to start selling this technology as a commercial technology. But now this third horizon has become, I would say, more like a second horizon, right? So like you keep moving, exploring new ideas all the time. And when it applies to kind of thinking about how you should prioritize your efforts in terms of markets and technologies, these horizons get transformed again into your core business, which is all about your mature technology that you're using for your existing markets to support your existing products, right? But then the second horizon is about emerging technologies. That's where it's important to keep your eyes open about what's emerging, right? And those emerging technologies are kind of overlapping with emerging markets, right? And a third horizon, which is the least possible to see, where there's more speculation going on, of course, it's completely new markets and new technologies, right? Sometimes it's very difficult to operate there because those markets are non-existent. And it's very hard to develop a product for a non-existent markets. Most companies don't want to pay attention to that. But when they become existent, it becomes too late. And this is why every digital transformation strategy needs to think about these three horizons, right? And at the third, let me rephrase this horizons in terms of specifically digital transformation, in terms of the three critical questions that we all have to answer. The first question at the first horizon, how you improve your existing business with digital solutions, right? It is still an incremental improvement, but you are gradually improving what you have right now with digital. It's a very important goal, and we have to spend, according to Google and some other tech companies, approximately from 60 to 70% of your effort on that, answering that question. The second question is how you grow your business as if physical did not exist at all. That is very disruptive, of course, right? Because most of us, most of the incumbent businesses, I would say, rely on their physical products, their physical existing infrastructure and services. But that's where it helps actually to think about your tomorrow as unrelated to your today's business, right? How can you grow your business as physical did not exist? Well, a short answer to that would be to think about how you can extract data from all of your processes, including your products, and turn that data into additional services, digital services and digital products that would be sitting on the top of your existing physical business, right? Products like services like selling your expertise, selling your position on the market, services like consulting, education, and so on, right? That would actually be able much more that you can build them by digitizing your processes and your products. And a third horizon would be how to build self-disruptive business models, right? And why would you want to build self-disruptive business models? Well, let's talk about that for a second, how here in Silicon Valley, companies do that. But before I jump to the third horizon, just to get back to the first one very quickly, how do you improve your existing business with digital? Again, this is probably what you do on a daily basis if you are a person responsible for digital transformation within your company, right? The good news is that most of the technologies that we hear have become, in many ways, commoditized. They've become developed and mature tools like RPA, for example, that we discussed in the past. Just a handful of years ago, like 5, 7, 10 years ago, robotics process automation was just an idea. Now it's a reality out there, that, or the cloud, right? Or mobile. Mobile is now something that we all are using. So there are lots of tools out there for any person who is in charge of digital transformation, right? All the microservices that are out there that we can now experiment with without undermining our core businesses, right? So now I would say is the best time than ever before to be a digital transformation officer. And the same applies to be a technology entrepreneur. Now is the best time to be a technology entrepreneur for pretty much the same reasons. The other idea that I wanted to suggest is that don't limit yourself to thinking just about product digitization as a way of digital transformation. Think about all elements of your business as an opportunity for improvement with digital tools, right? There is this book called 10 Types of Innovation that I would also encourage you to read. It's a pretty easy book to read, but I think it drives a very good point by suggesting that every element of your business can be divided into a part that can be innovated on its own as a separate element. Of course, all parts of the business usually are pretty connected and tightly connected with each other. But the way how we should train ourselves and think about improving our business at different stages and different functions of that business, I think it's a very useful idea, because we have seen lots of breakthroughs that had happened with technology companies, because they not only focused on products, they also focused about the ways how to become digital across the board within their companies, right? So when we talk about the second horizon, right, how you build your business as if physical did not exist in your company at all, the short answer, like I said before, would be think about creating digital derivatives of your physical businesses, right? How you can digitize your product by actually creating a new product, right? On the top of your existing products, and make that digital product available to much larger markets, right? Because it's digital. It creates an absolutely new opportunities for your business, as opposed to just focusing on on physical markets, on physical products, catering to limited markets. With the H3, with the Horizon 3 type of opportunities, I would bring your attention to the fact that most of the unicorns that I showed you before have chosen deliberately to act as digital platforms. They don't want to acquire physical assets, right? They don't want to focus on narrow markets. They want to be deliberately to become matchmakers, essentially build a service or a product that would bring other players from outside to consume the value on that platform. So I'm showing here lots of companies that you are familiar with, those who actually have deliberately chosen to become the platforms, right? Digital platforms. And the best example of a digital platform would be a marketplace, of course, like Uber or Airbnb and so on. But not always a platform is a marketplace, but in most cases, a digital marketplace is a platform, of course. What is a business of being a platform? How would you define it a little bit more formally? Well, platform is a company that enables external participants to build market value by using that platform and exchange that value with each other. That's what it's all about. And that's what I personally believe all companies are going to become, because they already are platforms. Your companies, when you think about it, you have your customers and you have your suppliers. And what you do some kind of a magic in between, right? So that magic, when it gets completely automated and digitized, it turns into a platform, right? And there are some features that already characterize platforms who have been built as digital from the beginning. And you have to, I would suggest that everyone understands those elements of digital platforms. The first and probably most important, in my opinion, is the so-called network effect. Network effect is the value that gets created by adding more consumers to your product. With physical products, the more consumers you add to the consumption of that product, the value of the product declines naturally. It's like a pie. If you invite 5 people to your company to eat that pie, they're gonna get a bigger share of that pie than 10 people, right? So there is a decline in the value of every product that is built physically, or you have to build more of them, of course, the scale economy, so to say. The network economy works in a very different way. The more users you add to that, the more valuable that pie becomes to every one of them. And then there are a few other elements. Control, very important, right?
We have about 10 minutes left.
10 minutes, okay. Control is important because you want to minimize friction when you invite consumers of your product and suppliers to interact with each other directly. And what you do, you create the automated way for them essentially to come as close to each other as possible. And it kind of goes against the logic of normal company, because in the normal company, you want to hide that process. Commercial secrets, right? I don't want to tell anybody how you create that drug, for example. And there are lots of limitations, of course, for regulative purposes and others, why I don't want to connect my suppliers, so to say, with my customers, right? But when you actually think about the way how it's going to be done in the future, 10, 20, 50, maybe even years from now, we will see that every company is going to become a platform. Standardization, openness, automation, ownership. I've mentioned some of them already, so I'm not going to spend too much time on this. I would rather encourage you to read these books, right? All of these books were written, including that exponential organization I mentioned, were written about the way how platforms operate. And think about all of those lessons that you read there in terms of your business. To what extent can you build a platform out of your existing physical business? One of the good reasons that I mentioned is network effects, right? If the normal companies, the bigger they become, the more flat their growth becomes, right? In the end, the network-enabled companies grow exponentially, specifically because network effects brings more value to every participant, until, of course, you become a monopoly on that market. Then, no company can grow indefinitely. And when Facebook has become a virtual monopoly on the social media market, of course, it's not growing as fast as it was in terms, at least the number of people that are using this company, right? Because they have pretty much taken everyone. So I've already kind of touched on this idea of why network effects are essential, right? The way how network effects gets built within every company that pays attention to that can be illustrated very easily with this example that comes from telecom business. When you connect 2 people together with the phones, You establish only one connection between them. Connection is the value. The phones are the costs, right? So when you connect 5 people together, you have to produce 5 phones, but then you already have 10 connections. So the number of connections is growing faster with the adding more people to that than the costs. And that's what you get. Your costs continue growing linearly within your company, while the value that you build for your participants and your customers is growing exponentially. So it becomes the best way to build and protect your business against any disruption. Companies that have a network effect inbuilt inside of them are probably the best positioned to protect themselves against digital disruption. And that's what you have to think about when you think about digital transformation. How do you transform your company with the strategic goals in mind, not just incremental goals, but with that third horizon in mind, that you have network effect working really for your benefit and not for the benefit of your competitors. This is another example of network effect from a company like Uber, where Uber has used this illustration when they filed for going public to convince investors that network effect is actually the most important part of the business value that Uber has created with their app. Essentially, the idea is that the more drivers you have on your platform, the more customers you will get in every single region, and the more the more passengers you have, you also get more drivers in that part. So that the drivers, they're not just competitors with each other. They also gain value from having more drivers in your region, right?
5 minutes left.
5 minutes left, okay. So there are all kinds of degrees and types of network effects that I would encourage you to explore as they specifically apply to your business. And now the last idea. I see the question here. I would be happy to answer that question. Very good question. Are you sure that Uber is a good example of network effect? They seem to be losing more money with more rides. That's a very good point that Dennis, you just made. Uber is not the best example of network effects, of course. No, it's not. But Uber has become a virtual, well, it's not a virtual monopoly. It's a dominant force on many markets because of the network effects. The way how they have chosen to balance their revenues and their costs of selling their rights as opposed to the revenues that they're getting, that's another question. They are deliberately losing money in order, if you are, again, I will probably spend a little bit of more time on that in the remaining 5 minutes when we talk about what self-disruption is all about. Uber is still going through the self-disruption process, even though it's a public company, which makes it very dangerous, of course, right? If you are a money-losing company in being public, investors might punish you dearly because they don't care about you trying to disrupt your own business. They care about you being a profitable company. But I will tell you a few ideas why it makes sense to lose money in order to become a monopoly, right? And that's what Uber has been doing right now. Let me jump to that topic just very quickly. I'll try to finish within the next 5 minutes, even though I have a few slides left. The idea about self-disruption is that when at the first horizon kind of transformation, you are focusing on those revenues and those products that will eventually decline sooner or later. At the second horizon, you are focusing on the new products, right? And those products better be 10x higher quality, or ideally, I would say, something much higher quality and also lower price. The danger of that of doing that, of course, is that you might kill your own business, right? By introducing much better and cheaper products. What's interesting is that in Silicon Valley, lots of companies have practiced exactly doing that. And I'm giving you the quote from Tim Cook from Apple. actually saying that we encourage that process. And that's what they have done when you look at the way how they have introduced sequentially products that have killed the previous generation of products. Like iPhone, for example, has pretty much killed iPod, and iPad had precipitated the decline of, well, not the decline, but the reduction in the unit sale of Macs, right? This is what Apple has been doing, and yet Apple continued to grow because the next population, the next generation of products have been much more successful on the markets. The third horizon for Apple was services, right? Now they don't even care that they don't sell much of iPhones anymore, right? They care that their services are now being consumed more than even, they make more money out of services than they make from hardware. Well, that's probably not the case yet, but when you look at the growth rate of Apple over the last 3 to 2 years, that was mostly, that additional growth has been fueled by that third horizon, by the fact that we now look at Apple not as a hardware company anymore. Now it's a service company. Now that I pay for their video, their music, and other services, you know, Apple has transformed itself into a service business. The same with Facebook, the same with Netflix. Netflix is another amazing example, but I have to probably skip this example, how Netflix has transformed itself from being a DVD rental company into becoming a digital original content studio for themselves, right? And also being a platform, by the way, by inviting independent studio producers to create that content that Netflix puts their own label on the top of it, right? So I'm gonna skip the slides. I also had an example of Microsoft that has also transformed itself over the last 5 years by moving on the cloud and offering, and now the cloud is responsible for 70% of Microsoft revenues, right? And now that Microsoft has pretty much has become de facto a cloud company, their stock has been growing over the last 5 years at the exponential, close to exponential rate as well. How can Silicon Valley help? Just very quickly, Silicon Valley is one of those interesting places, and it's more a philosophy now, not really a physical place, where there is an abundance of resources. It kind of sounds interesting that, you know, resources are actually much more abundant than our ability to use them and execute new ideas based on those resources. But let me tell you, there are about 5 to 1 excess of capital in Silicon Valley to the number of people who are capable of taking that capital and turning it into new companies, successful companies, right? There's only one scarcity here, is the scarcity of execution. That's where the biggest difficulty is, that there are not that many people who are capable to take these ideas, take these resources, put them together, and turn it into a successful unicorn or successfully transformed digital company. But that's what we all have to learn nowadays. And that's what I would encourage you to do, not just by doing it from inside of your business, but also think about all of those outside resources. Think about going out and using startups as external R&D labs for your corporate purposes by establishing a mutually beneficial process of exchanging value between your company and a startup, right? Silicon Valley is useful by offering all kinds of methodologies, all kinds of ideas. All you need to do is just to pay attention. That's what most people don't have time for, ironically speaking, right? But that's why, you know, many of our businesses become fossilized, businesses that get phased out. It's because we don't pay attention to what's happening around us, right? And we have to. And this is what we have to do in case of disruption. We have to act before we start feeling the pain, before we must act, before disruption affects us. And with that, I would like to finish my presentation. Thank you, everyone. We will make the slides available to you, and I still have about 10 minutes to answer some of your questions.
Yes, yes. Thank you. Thank you, Andrey. We had a small chat discussion about the Uber and how they're burning money with their
Oh yeah,
model.
let me actually answer that question right away.
Let me actually
Okay.
before you go there, let me actually add something kind of to piggyback from your Silicon Valley approach. So
Yes, go ahead.
if you look into the Silicon Valley valuations in terms of venture capital, in terms of the investors, they're all really looking for the revenue. They're looking for the revenue growth. Companies doing everything to get the revenue. Why? Because revenue is really the only thing that is really hard to optimize. You can pretty much optimize your internal processes. You can do RPA. You can hire a better workforce, but winning your revenue is the most complicated things. And examples like Facebook that were not profitable for the first, 10 years, but now they're making tons of money. Google, all of that is how
Amazon.
Silicon Valley works. They all chasing the revenue, building the revenue at whatever costs, and then optimizing to get the bottom line up.
Yeah,
Sorry, that's
I would add to that the fact that actually being unprofitable is often your best way to compete with others. Jeff Bezos used to famously say to their competitors from physical chains when they laughed at him sometimes that, okay, you are growing fast, but you're not profitable company. He used to shoot back at them to say by saying, your profit is my opportunity, meaning that if I can expand my business without being profitable, it's very difficult to compete with that business. Who is going to compete with a crazy company that is not making profits like Uber, right? But that's what Uber wants. Uber wants every competition around you to think that Uber is losing money. It's a bad company. Like Netflix, it's the same story. You look at most of the those fast-growing companies, they're willing to sacrifice profits for the sake of that crazy growth. And if it's possible to make that growth unprofitable for as long as it's possible, essentially by fending off competition from that business, right? But then what happens? In the end of the day, when you become a monopoly, you control the prices. And that's when you actually can become overnight a profitable company, right? So in the beginning, you sacrifice everything for the purpose of becoming a monopoly, right? And when you drive your prices down, like Uber did, right? Their rides are so cheap, much cheaper than taxi rides prices used to be, rates, right? So taxi drivers are out of business, including that reason as well. And there is no much of competition because nobody wants to compete with these low rates. But when Uber becomes an established company, this is when Uber, of course, it's not going to be unprofitable all the time. They control the prices. They can become profitable at every split second that they want to. The reason they don't want to be like that is because they don't feel comfortable about their existing position yet. They're not a fully established global monopoly. When they will become, we will see a totally different profitability. Usually, now people don't just talk about growth at any expense, of course, right? The situation on the market has changed a lot for the last, I would say, 3-4 years. Now there is a so-called rule of 40 that gets applied to trying to evaluate how successful your company is. And usually that rule of 40 applies to SaaS companies, software as a service, where you add your annual growth rate, let's say it's 10%, to your internal profitability. Let's say it's 25%. If you can balance those two things when you put them together, and if it's above 40, let's say 15 plus 25, it's about 40, right? That means you have a tremendous business on your hands. Doesn't matter whether it's more in favor of growth as opposed to profit or the other way around. Well, most investors, if you want to grow exponentially, they want to see the bigger the first number responsible for the growth as opposed to the profit. But once you become a monopoly, that's when you start changing that ratio within that rule of 40 in favor of profit at the expense of your growth. I hope it makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. Do we have any other questions?
Hello, thank you for the presentation, Andrey. I have one question. This is Axel from Novartis. And in one slide that you shared with us, we saw that healthcare is maybe at the bottom of the digitalized industries. I think that it's the previous to the last one, with a 47% of adoption of digitalization. And my question is, uh, what are your thoughts about the reasons that um, cause that the digitalization in healthcare is lower than in other sectors?
Right. Well, there are a few obvious reasons behind the uh, lower percentage rates, let's say, right? One reason, of course, comes from regulation, right? If your industry, like for example, Novartis is a pharma company, right? You guys create new drugs. And of course, in your industry, there is much more regulation going on with the governments trying to establish certain ways how the new drugs get approved, right? And if it's a few years that it takes to approve a new product, obviously that requires it makes it slower for disruption, right? More higher barriers of entry. The other reason is that building a new product still takes a longer time. The capital intensity with certain industries for building new products and distributing those products are much higher. Software industry, for example, it's a completely capital, I would say, free at this point. Now that you have so much open source still being developed, like if you want to build a new software company, in the past, you would need to something like $10 million just to get it off the ground 20 years ago, 30 years ago. Now you can do it with like $100,000. The cost of building a new business and a new product have declined significantly with certain industries, but with other industries like pharma, for example, right? Those costs are still there. You're still protected against direct disruption from your competition because of that capital intensity, because of the government regulation, because of the requirements, a long-term product development cycle that you have, right? So in some ways it's a blessing, but in other ways it's also a danger because many companies are not, they don't feel that they have to transform quickly, right? But the thing is that transformation is coming to every industry. I have a friend who is inventing, also working in a startup that is inventing a new medicine, a new drug. He's a chief medical officer in that company. And he told me that over the last 5 years that he was working in that startup, they were able to accelerate this longer product development cycle by a magnitude, right? Again, because of all the new technologies that they've been using to interact with the customers, do faster testing. The government is still slow, of course, to approve. But now with the COVID, I think creating a completely new mindset within the government that sometimes would require the approval of the new products happen much faster, right? Much faster. And maybe what used to be a normal rule in the past, even in such conservative industries like pharma, is going to change. And you have to be prepared for that change. You have to act before it becomes a reality, because then it will be much more difficult for companies like Novartis to compete with the upstarts, right? That will immediately start populating your industry.
Yeah, and I just want to add on that, like healthcare in general, right? That it's booked on the doctors, right? And it's still the amount of training that goes into the doctorship in every country is so great that you can only automate to a certain extent.
That's true, but it's still happening, right?
Yeah.
It's happening faster than ever before. Even think about the doctors. My mother-in-law had some, again, I'm sorry for giving you personal examples, but I think it just adds some color to this. She had to go to doctor. She cannot right now because of all the stuff that is happening. Now these virtual appointments that were unthinkable in the past have become a routine practice. Her doctor has essentially gave her some diagnostics and some suggestions over the phone, just via Zoom, right? We all understand that there are, of course, limited ways how we can use Zoom for communicating doctors with patients. But what the doctor told me, I was there as well. He said, like, actually 70% of all of my communication with my patients can be safely done without physical visits. The doctors are actually now realizing that there's more digitization possible in their profession than they ever thought about in the past, simply because of, again, of inertia and the habits that die very hard.
And this is how you cut your liver out, right?
Well,
Andrey, I do have one question.
Yes, please.
And thank you so much for sharing. I was actually reading the model that you presented on the tree horizon, and it's really hard for me to understand, because I'm going to explain it this way. When you said in the horizon one, like the first region, it's really easy to set a target for the team that works on this horizon, because you're talking about the now, you're talking about the sales that is currently ongoing within the corporation or within the company. But when you talk about Horizon 3, these teams are working for a lot of stuff that are very keen to fail. Like, you have a high probability to fail. So how do you set a target, or how do you set goals for these kind of teams and do not lose them in the process of creating? Because whenever you're trying to innovate, whenever you're trying to do something new, you know you must fail, but you must have some success as well. So how do you set a target for a team that's working on Horizon 3?
Right. Well, it obviously requires various assumptions that you make about the future, and you start testing those assumptions by running small experiments, right? The size, what can be called small, varies, of course, depending on your business and your industry and how much resources you have to put into every experiment. But again, many industries like pharma, for example, guys, I'm sorry for referring to it, but you guys are used to rigorous experimentation when you do products, right? And for some reason, it's not the case very often when it comes to business ideas, as if business ideas should not be built on the same rigorous experimentation. When you set up assumptions about how the future is going to look like, and of course, it's hard to predict that future, but that's what all of us have to practice nowadays, simply because the future is now happening to us much faster than it ever did before. The exponential rate of progress is accelerating, right? So things are happening much faster now. And we can get the validation for some of those ideas much faster than we ever been able before to do so. What I'm saying is that if you establish your unit for a third horizon, where you start projecting your vision or your leadership vision of the future on the concrete ways of developing new products or new practices, so that you can start testing some of those ideas independently from each other by almost like running experiments, right? And see which ones of them actually gain traction. That's the only way how digital players here in Silicon Valley have been able to master this art of shaping the future by running this third horizon, right? By essentially, let me put it this way. Let me just give you one example, like Google, for example. The way how they were able to become de facto the leader in autonomous driving was that they believed in that before everyone else did. They saw that future before everyone else would seriously consider that cars at some point will be driving themselves. 15, 20 years ago, that was considered to be a completely insane notion, or actually irrelevant notion, right? Like, nobody entertained themselves with that idea. They did. And if we wait for a few more years, we're going to see these cars. We already see them to a certain degree on our streets, right? This is what it takes. Sometimes nowadays, it doesn't take 20 years to see that future. It takes, I would say, depending on the industry and the company, between probably 5 to 10 years at most, right? A third horizon is not even about the time anymore, because the disruption is happening to us right now. And if it's happening to us right now, a third horizon has to be about prioritization of your efforts. It's not about the way how you postpone that reality into the future. The future is happening to us right away. And you have to react to that by inventing this new business model and new ideas right now, as if the future was already happening to you. And there is a great article about that, by the way, that I would encourage you to read by Steve Blank about why third horizon doesn't make sense. He called it this way. But actually, he didn't mean that. He meant that all three horizons have to be happening right away. And that's what, his name is Steve Blank, and I would encourage you to just take a look at that article. I think it was published in Harvard Business Review a few months ago.
All right, just being aware of our time, we'll have our next speaker, Matthew, on the line. So
another question from Russian counterparts, sir.
Oh, sure.
Okay.
So, do we always need to try to become a platform? Is there any critical value of business after which the efforts for creating platform are important? Has anyone become a super successful person using a platform creatively but not become a platform?
Well, as I showed you previously, examples of platforms here, all of these companies have become platforms. Maybe your question was about an established companies that have transformed themselves into becoming platforms, more modern platforms. I would say that my last example of Microsoft has been, I was going to use it specifically to illustrate how an older company whose products have been pretty much already discounted as something belonging to the past has transformed themselves to become a cloud-based platform in terms of delivering their services. There are quite a few examples as well, but what I would suggest, since I speak Russian myself and we have to give time to Matthew for his presentation, all questions that have come from that group, I'll be happy to address separately in a session that we can organize specifically for a different, for that group, guys. Take any questions. But actually, I'll be happy, like I said, to talk to anyone one-on-one about your questions after this presentation. So thank you, everyone. And let's continue this dialogue in some other time. And now we get Matthew, who is a great speaker, a good friend, and has a great relevant experience to talk about platforms as well, by the way. So Matthew, welcome
Thank you
to our program.
Hi, everyone.